Pherecydes of Syros, centuries before Plato and centuries before Aristotle, was grappling with the deepest questions about the nature of the cosmos, the soul, and time, at a time when the Greek world was beginning to discover that the human mind could comprehend the universe without the aid of the gods. The teacher of Pythagoras, the author of the first Greek prose cosmology, and the first thinker in the Western tradition to articulate the immortality of the soul not merely as a mythological idea, but as a philosophical one, was Pherecydes, the teacher of Pythagoras.
Syros bridged
This is the story of the man who bridged the gap between the ancient world of gods and monsters and the extraordinary philosophical civilization that followed.
Pherecydes was born on the island of Syros, a small rocky island in the center of the Cyclades in the Aegean Sea, sometime around the year 600 before the Common Era, though the dates associated with his life are approximate enough that scholars continue to debate them. Syros sat at a crossroads in the ancient Mediterranean world, close enough to the major sea lanes that its inhabitants were exposed to ideas and travelers from every direction, from the Ionian Greek cities to the east, with their emerging tradition of rational inquiry into nature, from Phoenicia and Egypt to the south and east, with their ancient traditions of cosmological speculation, and from the broader Greek world in every direction, with its rich inheritance of mythological narrative and religious practice. The island was not a major political or intellectual center, but it was precisely the kind of place where someone with an unusually open and synthesizing mind could absorb influences from multiple directions without being completely dominated by the authority of any single tradition. Pherecydes grew up in this intellectual crosscurrents, and the philosophy he eventually produced bears the marks of a mind that had been exposed to more than one way of understanding the world. The intellectual context of 6th century Greece was one of extraordinary ferment and possibility. The Milesian philosophers, most famously Thales, and then Anaximander and Anaximenes, had already begun the project of explaining the natural world through natural rather than supernatural causes, asking what the fundamental stuff of reality is and answering with proposals like water or the boundless or air rather than with stories about divine personalities. Simultaneously, the tradition of epic poetry and mythological narrative that Homer and Hesiod had crystallized remained enormously powerful as a way of understanding human experience and cosmic order, providing frameworks for thinking about the gods, about fate, about the relationship between mortals and immortals, and about what happens to human souls after death. Pherecydes occupied a distinctive and fascinating position in relation to both these traditions, drawing on the narrative and theological richness of the mythological inheritance, while pushing toward the kind of principled, systematic explanation of cosmic origins that the Milesians were developing in a more strictly naturalistic direction. Ancient sources consistently describe Pherecydes as a largely self-taught thinker who had managed to acquire access to Phoenician writings and possibly to Egyptian texts as well, suggesting that his education went beyond the normal Greek sources available to a young man of his time and place. The Phoenicians were among the most widely traveled and commercially sophisticated people of the ancient Mediterranean, maintaining connections across the entire coastal world from their home cities on the Levantine coast. And they possessed not only their own substantial intellectual traditions, but access to the knowledge accumulated by the civilizations they traded with. The claim that Pherecydes learned from Phoenician sources is not verifiable in any strict sense, but it is consistent with the character of his thought, which draws on imagery and ideas that seem to have connections to ancient Near Eastern cosmological speculation alongside its clearly Greek elements. Whether through Phoenician texts, Egyptian contacts, or simply an extraordinarily wide and attentive reading of everything available to him, Pherecydes developed a breadth of intellectual horizon that was unusual for his time and place. The reputation that Pherecydes acquired during his lifetime extended beyond the purely intellectual and into the domain that his contemporaries would have called the prophetic or the divinely inspired. Several ancient sources attribute to him the ability to predict future events, including the outcomes of military conflicts, the arrival of storms at sea, and even the occurrence of earthquakes. And whether these stories reflect actual instances of unusual perceptual acuity, the kind of careful observation of natural signs that any sufficiently attentive person might cultivate, or simply the tendency of later tradition to embellish the biography of a remarkable figure with appropriately remarkable characteristics, they tell us something important about how he was perceived. He was not seen by his contemporaries simply as an unusually learned man who had figured out some clever things about the cosmos. He was seen as someone who had achieved a kind of access to the deep structure of reality that gave him capacities beyond those of ordinary human beings. This reputation for unusual wisdom and unusual power of perception would have made him an extraordinarily attractive figure to a young Pythagoras seeking a teacher who could give him more than conventional learning. The relationship between Pherecydes and Pythagoras is one of the most intriguing in the entire history of ancient philosophy, and it is attested by enough different ancient sources that its basic reality is generally accepted even by scholars who are skeptical about many of the specific stories told about both figures. What the ancient sources consistently report is that Pythagoras was a student of Pherecydes, that Pherecydes was enormously fond of Pythagoras and treated him with special care, and that when Pherecydes was dying, it was Pythagoras who came to attend him and who remained with him until the end. This is not simply a story about intellectual transmission. It is a story about profound personal attachment, about a relationship that went beyond the formal structures of teaching and learning into something that looked more like the bond between a father and a spiritual heir. The ideas that Pherecydes developed, particularly his conception of the soul and its persistence after death, would become central to the Pythagorean tradition in a form elaborated far beyond anything Pherecydes himself had developed. And understanding Pythagoras requires understanding where his most fundamental convictions came from. The physical circumstances of Pherecydes' death, as recorded in ancient sources, have a quality that seems almost designed to illustrate his philosophical significance. He is said to have died on Syros, the island of his birth, after a long illness, and Pythagoras is reported to have been present at the deathbed. Some sources describe him as dying in a state of unusual equanimity, accepting his death without distress or complaint, consistent with the philosophical orientation toward death that would become central to the traditions that grew from his teaching. Others describe him as dying from a disease of the skin that caused worms to infest his body, a detail that is both physiologically specific and philosophically suggestive, since it seems to depict the very dissolution of the physical form that he had philosophically argued was not the end of the soul that inhabited it. Whether this detail is historical or legendary, it captures something true about the relationship between Pherecydes' thought and his mortality. He was a man who had spent his intellectual life thinking carefully about what death means, and his own death became, at least in the tradition that preserved his memory, an illustration of the ideas he had spent his life developing. The most important text associated with Pherecydes is known by various names in the ancient sources, but the title that has attracted the most scholarly attention is the Heptamychos, which can be translated as the 7 recesses or the 7 chambers, referring to the 7 regions or cavities of the cosmos that apparently played a central role in his cosmological scheme. This work is lost, surviving only in fragments and summaries preserved by later writers who themselves were often working from secondary sources, but enough material has survived to give us a genuine, if incomplete, picture of a cosmological vision that was remarkable for its combination of mythological narrative form with proto-philosophical systematic ambition. Understanding what Pherecydes was attempting in this text is essential to understanding his place in the history of thought, because he was doing something that had not quite been done before in the Greek world, even if the full significance of what he was doing would only become clear in retrospect. The Heptamychos began, according to the ancient reports, not with the genealogy of gods in the manner of Hesiod's theogony, but with three original principles that Pherecydes named Zos, Chronos, and Chthonie. Zos is recognizably related to Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods in Greek religion, but the relationship is not straightforward because Pherecydes presents Zos not as one god among others within an already existing cosmos, but as one of the original three realities from which the cosmos itself was generated. Chronos is time, and by placing time among the original three, Pherecydes was making an extraordinary philosophical move, asserting that time is not a dimension of an already existing world, but one of the fundamental principles from which the world itself arises. Chthonie is an earth figure, and her name means something like the dark or the underground one, connecting her to the deep powers of the earth that were associated in Greek religious thought with the realm of the dead and with the most ancient and powerful forces of nature. The relationship between these three original principles and the origin of the cosmos is described in ancient sources through a series of mythological episodes that have a quality quite unlike the more familiar mythologies of Homer and Hesiod. The most famous episode involves a great cloth or garment that Zas weaves and embroiders with figures of the earth and the sea, which he then presents to Chthonie as a bridal gift, an act that transforms her into Ge, the earth, and marks the beginning of the ordered cosmos as we know it. This story sounds like pure mythology, and in its surface form it is, but its philosophical content is significant because it presents the creation of the ordered world as an act of craftsmanship and gift-giving rather than as a battle between cosmic forces, suggesting a cosmos whose order is in some sense intentional, the product of purposive activity rather than mere chance or conflict, while still maintaining the narrative and personal form of mythological storytelling rather than the abstract, impersonal form of the Milesian cosmologies. The role of Chronos in the Heptamychos is philosophically the most interesting and the most difficult to reconstruct from the surviving fragments. Chronos is said to have created fire, water, and wind from his own seed, and these three elements then generated the subsequent structure of the cosmos. This makes Chronos not simply a personification of time in the way that later allegorical thinking would use such figures, but a genuine generative principle, something more like what the Milesians were pointing at with their concept of the fundamental material of reality, except that Pherecydes' version of this principle has the character of creative agency rather than passive material substratum. Time, for Pherecydes, is not the dimension within which things happen, but the principle from which things arise, and this represents a sophisticated and original philosophical insight, the recognition that temporality is not a backdrop to reality, but a constitutive feature of it. The seven recesses or chambers that gave the text its most distinctive title are unfortunately among the least well-attested aspects of Pherecydes' cosmological scheme, surviving in fragments that are too brief and too unclear to support confident reconstruction. What can be inferred is that the seven regions represented a systematic division of the cosmos into distinct domains, perhaps corresponding to different levels or regions of the universe, perhaps related to the seven zones of the underworld that played an important role in ancient Near Eastern cosmological thinking, perhaps connected to the seven celestial bodies visible to ancient astronomers. The number 7 was cosmologically significant in multiple ancient traditions, and Pherecydes' use of it suggests either a deliberate engagement with the numerological thinking that would become central to Pythagoreanism, or a connection to older traditions that he had absorbed through his exposure to Phoenician or other Near Eastern sources. Whatever the precise content of the seven-region scheme, it represents an attempt to impose systematic spatial structure on the cosmos, to divide reality into distinct regions according to some principle, and this systematizing impulse is itself philosophically significant, regardless of the specific content. The ancient sources also preserve fragments from the Heptamychos that describe a cosmic battle or conflict involving a serpent named Ophionius and his companions, who waged war against Chronos and his companions, with the loser of the conflict being cast down into Oganos, the ocean that surrounds the world. This episode has attracted enormous scholarly attention because of its structural parallels with ancient Near Eastern creation mythologies, particularly the Babylonian Enuma Elish, which also features a primordial cosmic conflict as part of the creation narrative. Whether Pherecydes was drawing directly on Babylonian or Phoenician mythological traditions, as some scholars have argued, or whether the similarities reflect the widespread availability of certain cosmological narrative patterns across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world, is a matter of ongoing debate. What the episode makes clear is that Pherecydes was not simply inventing new mythology from scratch, but was working with and transforming existing mythological traditions into something that served his philosophical purposes. If the Heptamychos represents Pherecydes' most sustained attempt at cosmological explanation, his most philosophically consequential contribution may have been his treatment of the human soul and its relationship to death, because what he appears to have said about the soul represents a decisive break from the way that most earlier Greek thinking had approached this question. The Homeric tradition, which shaped the understanding of death and the afterlife for most Greeks of the Archaic period, presented the soul after death as a kind of shadowy diminishment of the living person, a wraith that descended to the underworld to live a pale and joyless existence, deprived of the warmth and energy of bodily life, and unable to think clearly or communicate effectively except under special circumstances. This was not a vision designed to make death less frightening or to suggest that what mattered most about a person would survive their physical dissolution. Pherecydes seems to have proposed something fundamentally different. The ancient sources, including Cicero, who is one of our most important witnesses to the history of ancient philosophy, directly credit Pherecydes with being the first Greek thinker to assert that the souls of human beings are immortal in a philosophically substantive sense. This is not the limited immortality of the Homeric shade, which continues to exist after death, but in a diminished and joyless way, and it is not the special immortality of the Olympian gods, which is simply a feature of their divine nature having nothing to do with ordinary human beings. What Pherecydes appears to have asserted is that the soul, understood as the essential self, persists after death in a meaningful and continuous way, that it retains its identity and its capacity for experience, and that this persistence is a genuine feature of what souls are, rather than a special gift granted under exceptional circumstances. This was a revolutionary idea, and its influence on subsequent thinking, particularly through Pythagoras and then through Plato, was enormous.
The specific form that Pherecydes' doctrine of the soul took is, like so much else about his thought, difficult to reconstruct precisely from the fragments that survive. There are suggestions in ancient sources that he believed in some form of transmigration or reincarnation, the idea that souls pass from one body to another after death, and that the soul's current embodied existence is one episode in a longer journey rather than its first and only appearance in the world. This would connect his thinking about the soul directly to the doctrine of metempsychosis that became central to Pythagorean philosophy and later to Platonic philosophy, and it would suggest that Pythagoras's famous and distinctive belief in the transmigration of souls was not an independent discovery, but an inheritance from his teacher, refined and elaborated within the Pythagorean system, but fundamentally Pherecydean in origin. The connection between Pherecydes' cosmological thinking about the 7 recesses of the cosmos and his doctrine of the soul is suggestive here, since the 7 regions might have served as the stages or stations through which souls pass on their journey between death and rebirth.
What philosophical reasoning, if any, supported Pherecydes' assertion of soul immortality is not recoverable from the surviving fragments with any certainty. Ancient sources sometimes present him simply as someone who held this view without giving us access to the arguments he might have offered in its support. And in some cases, the way his views are described suggests that they were expressed through mythological narrative rather than through explicit philosophical argumentation, which was in any case a mode of intellectual discourse that had not yet been fully developed in Pherecydes' time. What we can say is that his assertion of soul immortality was connected to a broader cosmological vision, in which the soul was understood as a principle that participates in the same eternal order that governs the cosmos as a whole, rather than as a purely biological phenomenon that arises with the body and perishes with it. The cosmos, in Pherecydes' account, was not a purely material system, but a structured order in which something like soul or mind played an essential role, and individual human souls were in some sense participants in that larger order, rather than merely accidental byproducts of physical processes. The influence of Pherecydes' teaching about the soul on the subsequent history of Greek philosophy is difficult to overstate, even though it is often underappreciated because it is mediated primarily through the Pythagorean tradition rather than through direct textual transmission of Pherecydes' own work. When Plato, in dialogues like the Phaedo and the Republic, offers arguments for the immortality of the soul and describes the soul's journey through death and rebirth, he is working within a tradition that goes back through Pythagoras to Pherecydes, a tradition in which the philosophical assertion of soul immortality had been established as a serious intellectual position rather than a mere piece of popular mythology. The specific arguments Plato makes are his own, and they represent an enormous philosophical sophistication compared to anything we can attribute to Pherecydes. But the fundamental conviction that the soul is something real, persistent, and morally significant in its own right, rather than simply a feature of biological life, was something that Pherecydes had put into the tradition, and Plato's philosophy would have been very different without it. The moral implications of soul immortality, which becomes so central to Platonic philosophy and to the broader tradition that followed it, seem to have been present, at least in embryonic form, in Pherecydes' own thinking. If the soul persists after death, then what happens to the soul after death is a matter of genuine concern, and how the soul lived during its period of embodiment becomes relevant to what it will experience in its subsequent existence. Ancient sources suggest that Pherecydes may have connected the condition of the soul after death to the quality of the life it had lived, anticipating the elaborate systems of post-mortem reward and punishment that appear in Pindar, in Plato, and eventually in the various traditions of esoteric thought that were influenced by Pythagorean ideas. The cosmos that Pherecydes described, with its structured regions and its three original principles, was not morally neutral, not simply a physical system operating according to impersonal mechanical laws, but a moral order in which the soul's journey had stakes that extended beyond biological death. One of the most historically significant things about Pherecydes is his position in the broader transformation of Greek religious and philosophical thought that was occurring during the 6th century before the Common Era, a transformation so profound and so far-reaching that it has been called, by scholars of the period, the Greek axial age. The Homeric and Hesiodic tradition that dominated Greek religious understanding had presented the cosmos as governed by gods who were essentially human in their psychology and their concerns, powerful beyond human measure, but not fundamentally different in kind from the heroes and mortals they dealt with, subject to emotions like jealousy, desire, anger, and favoritism, and organized into a political structure with Zeus as king that mirrored in some respects the political structures of human communities. This was a cosmology that made the universe comprehensible in terms that ordinary human experience could grasp, but it was also a cosmology that placed the ultimate explanatory principle of things in the arbitrary will of divine personalities, which meant that genuine systematic understanding of why things are as they are was not really available. Pherecydes was part of a generation of thinkers who, each in their own way, were moving away from this personalistic cosmology towards something that placed the explanatory foundation of things in principles rather than in personalities. The Milesians did this most radically and most purely, essentially removing the divine personalities from the cosmological picture altogether and replacing them with impersonal material principles. Pherecydes did something more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting. He kept the narrative form and the personal character of the mythological tradition while transforming the figures within that tradition from Olympian gods with specific histories and personal relationships into something more like philosophical principles dressed in mythological clothing. His Zos is related to Zeus, but is not simply Zeus. His Chronos is related to the personified time of popular imagination, but is in fact a cosmological principle. His Chthonie is related to the earth goddesses of the Greek religious tradition, but functions more like a philosophical principle than like a narrative character. This double character of Pherecydes' cosmological figures, simultaneously mythological and proto-philosophical, has made him difficult to categorize and has sometimes led scholars to underestimate his philosophical significance. If you read the Heptamychos, expecting either pure mythology or pure philosophy, you will be disappointed in both directions. But if you understand it as an attempt to do something new and inherently hybrid, to use the narrative and symbolic resources of the mythological tradition to think through genuinely philosophical problems about the nature of reality, the origin of the cosmos, and the fate of the soul, then it becomes a far more interesting and more significant text than its surface appearance might suggest. Pherecydes was working at a moment when the distinction between myth and philosophy had not yet been fully established, when the tools of purely rational argumentation had not yet been developed to the point where they could carry the full weight of a cosmological investigation. And his approach represents one possible response to that situation, an attempt to use what was available to think as clearly as possible about questions that were becoming impossible to answer adequately within the purely traditional framework. The treatment of divine figures in the Heptamychos reflects a broader shift in Greek religious thought during the 6th century that has been described by scholars as a move toward theological monism, or toward the rationalization of religious belief. Xenophanes of Colophon, a contemporary of Pherecydes, was explicitly arguing that the anthropomorphic conception of the gods in Homer and Hesiod was philosophically inadequate, that the real divine principle must be one rather than many, unchanging rather than subject to the passions and conflicts that Homer described, and universal rather than attached to specific places or peoples. Heraclitus of Ephesus, slightly later, was developing an account of divine logos, or rational principle, as the fundamental nature of reality. Pherecydes was not making these moves in quite the same way or with quite the same philosophical self-consciousness, but he was part of the same broader transformation, finding ways to think about the divine that pushed beyond the purely personalistic and towards something more systematic and more universal. The connection between Pherecydes and the Orphic religious tradition, which was also flourishing in the 6th century, and which shared with him a concern for the fate of the soul after death, is another dimension of his cultural significance that deserves attention. The Orphic tradition, associated with the legendary figure of Orpheus and his descent into the underworld, developed an elaborate theology of the soul's journey through death and rebirth, complete with cosmological narratives about the origins of the universe and the nature of the divine, that had significant structural parallels with what we know of Pherecydes' thought. Whether Pherecydes influenced the Orphic tradition, was influenced by it, or whether both were drawing on similar sources and developing similar ideas independently is not possible to determine with certainty from the surviving evidence, but the parallels are striking enough to suggest that Pherecydes was working within or adjacent to a broader religious and philosophical movement that was reconfiguring the Greek understanding of the soul, the cosmos, and the relationship between them. The legacy of this reconfiguration, which Pherecydes helped to initiate, extended far beyond the confines of ancient Greek thought. The conviction that the soul is something real, persistent, and morally significant, that the cosmos is a structured order rather than a chaos of competing divine wills, that time and the processes of change and generation are not simply features of the world, but fundamental aspects of its deep structure. These ideas became so thoroughly incorporated into the Western philosophical and religious tradition that it is almost impossible to think about them from the outside, to imagine what it would be like to think about reality without these convictions in place. Pherecydes did not, of course, single-handedly create these ideas, but he was among the earliest figures in the Greek tradition to put them into systematic form, and his influence through Pythagoras ensured that they became part of the intellectual inheritance that shaped philosophy, theology, and ultimately the entire culture that descends from the ancient Greek world.
The historical influence of Pherecydes is one of those cases where the significance of a thinker is inversely related to their current fame, where the degree to which their ideas shaped subsequent intellectual history is far out of proportion to how often their name appears in contemporary discussions. This disproportion is not primarily a result of the quality of his thought, which was genuine and remarkable for its time, but a result of the accidents of textual transmission, the near total loss of his original writings, and the way his ideas were absorbed into the Pythagorean tradition and became visible to later ages primarily through that tradition, rather than directly through his own work. Understanding how Pherecydes' ideas moved through history requires tracing a series of transmission chains that connect him, sometimes quite specifically and sometimes more diffusely, to some of the most important developments in subsequent philosophy, religion, and literature.
The most direct and best documented line of influence runs through Pythagoras, who was by all ancient accounts Pherecydes' most important student and the person most responsible for transmitting and elaborating the core of his teacher's philosophical vision. Pythagoras' philosophy was not simply an extension of Pherecydes', it was a massive creative transformation of certain fundamental convictions, most centrally the conviction that the soul is immortal and that it passes through a series of embodied existences, that the cosmos has a mathematical structure that the purified soul can come to understand, and that the cultivation of wisdom through a specific way of life can accelerate the soul's progress toward liberation from the cycle of rebirth. All of these convictions can be traced in some form to ideas present in Pherecydes' teaching, and the fact that Pythagoras developed them into a comprehensive philosophical and religious system with an enormous historical impact means that Pherecydes' influence, filtered through Pythagoras, extended far beyond what might otherwise have been possible given the loss of his direct textual legacy. The influence of Pherecydes on Plato, mediated through the Pythagorean tradition, is visible in some of the most characteristic and most important features of Platonic philosophy. The Platonic doctrine of the soul's immortality and its journey through a series of embodied existences, elaborated with extraordinary philosophical sophistication in dialogues like the Phaedo, the Republic, and the Phaedrus, is rooted in the tradition that goes back through Pythagoras to Pherecydes. The Platonic vision of the cosmos as a structured order in which soul plays a fundamental role, expressed most fully in the Timaeus, where a divine craftsman fashions the cosmos according to rational patterns, has structural parallels with Pherecydes' cosmological thinking, even though it has been transformed almost beyond recognition by the philosophical tools that Plato had available, and that Pherecydes did not. The conviction that philosophical wisdom, the genuine understanding of reality, involves understanding the cosmos as a moral order in which the soul has a specific and important role, is a conviction that connects Plato to the tradition in which Pherecydes was one of the earliest figures.
The Stoic philosophical tradition, which became perhaps the dominant school of philosophy in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, and which had an enormous influence on early Christian thought, also shows traces of the ideas that Pherecydes helped to introduce into the Greek intellectual tradition. The Stoic conception of the cosmos as a living, rational whole pervaded by a divine principle called logos or pneuma, with individual human souls as portions of the divine fire that gives the cosmos its rationality and its order, is a sophisticated philosophical development that has absorbed and transformed the Pherecydian and Pythagorean conviction that soul is something real and cosmically significant. The Stoic doctrine of cosmic cycles, according to which the entire cosmos periodically returns to its original state in a great conflagration before beginning anew, has structural parallels with aspects of Pherecydes' cosmological thinking about the relationship between original principles and the generated cosmos. The early Christian tradition, which was deeply shaped by both Platonic and Stoic philosophy, as well as by its Hebrew inheritance, absorbed many of the ideas that had entered the Greek intellectual tradition through the chain of transmission that includes Pherecydes. The Christian doctrine of the soul's immortality, the Christian conviction that the cosmos is a created order that reflects the rational purposes of its creator, the Christian concern for what happens to the soul after death, and the moral significance of how the soul conducts itself during its embodied existence, all of these are ideas that have been shaped, at multiple removes, by the tradition that Pherecydes helped to initiate. This does not mean, of course, that Christian theology is simply Pharisaidian philosophy in religious dress. The transformations involved are too profound and too many to support any such claim. But it does mean that the intellectual history of Western civilization is not fully comprehensible without some understanding of the contribution that Pherecydes made to the tradition from which it grew. The study of Pherecydes today presents challenges and opportunities that are characteristic of work on the pre-Socratic philosophers more broadly. The fragmentary state of the evidence means that reconstruction is always provisional, that confident claims about the specific content of his ideas are always vulnerable to revision in the light of new textual evidence or new scholarly interpretations of the evidence that already exists, and that the interpretation of his thought inevitably involves a degree of creative reconstruction that goes beyond what strict historical method can strictly justify. But the study of Pherecydes also offers something rare and genuinely exciting: the opportunity to stand as close as the evidence permits to one of those extraordinary intellectual moments when a human mind first grasped ideas that would shape the subsequent history of civilization. To watch, however dimly and however incompletely, the first formulation of convictions about the soul and the cosmos that are still shaping how human beings understand themselves and their world today. Pherecydes of Syros was not simply a philosopher who got there first, though getting there first matters enormously when what you are getting to first is an idea that will shape civilization for 2.5 millennia. He was someone who found a way to ask questions that his tradition had not given him language to ask, who built conceptual tools out of mythological materials because the purely philosophical tools had not yet been invented, and who produced in the process a vision of the soul, the cosmos, and time that proved to be among the most generative in the history of human thought. His student, Pythagoras, took what he taught and turned it into a philosophical and religious movement that transformed Greek intellectual life. Plato took what Pythagoras transmitted and turned it into one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive philosophical systems ever produced. The entire tradition that flows from Plato through the Neoplatonists and the early Christian thinkers and the medieval philosophers and the Renaissance humanists carries within it, at however many removes, something of the vision that Pherecydes first articulated on his small rocky island in the Aegean Sea.
When you encountered the idea that the soul is real and persistent, that death is not the end of what matters most about a person, that the cosmos is an ordered whole in which mind and soul play a fundamental role, you are encountering an idea whose history in the Western tradition begins with a largely forgotten thinker who stood at the very edge of the world where myth ends and philosophy begins, and chose to keep walking forward into the unknown. If the story of Pherecydes has sparked something in you, subscribe to this channel and stay with us as we continue to explore the thinkers who built the foundations of human understanding, because the most important ideas in history almost always began with someone whose name we barely remember.